Hey YouTube. In this one, I want to talk about the idea of unfixation or non-fixation. And I got this idea via Jake Orthwine on Twitter, who I think got it from Shinzen Young, the Dharma teacher. And I think it's a really useful frame to point at what I think is going on in Alexander technique and what it's really pointing towards. So rather than body stuff, it's deeper and goes into this unfixation thing. So first of all, what do I mean by fixation? Fixation is like when you see a child cycling into a tree. They've got target fixation. They don't want to hit the tree, but they're so focused on the tree that they're not able to detach from it and go somewhere else. They can't go over there because they're fixated on the tree. Now, Alexander technique, I think, is a way of broadening your possibility space so that you could go that way, you could go that way. Even if you choose to go this way, you have the option, you have the felt sense availability of I can do whatever I want to do ultimately. And that's what goes away when we fixate. So it's very common in body terms to fixate in such a way as to make sure your body can stay stable even if you've slightly checked out. It seems that a lot of the dynamic balance systems in our body require a certain level of engaged consciousness. So for example, if you're in a social type setting, you might catch yourself locking your knees back, pushing your pelvis forward slightly and crossing your arms. And that's a very stable position. You won't fall over, but it's also locked. You kind of have to unlock it before you do something else. The other version of this is the dynamic balance, where nothing is locked, and you're slightly swaying, slightly moving, available in every joint. But you kind of have to be there for that. Your conscious mind is sufficiently quickened, is the term that Alexander used, to make sure that you're still coordinated and you don't fall over, basically. And what AT teachers do, I think, is that they notice fixation, they notice the locking, the tendency of the mind to get stuck in that kind of, I'm going to leave my body on autopilot while I go off and think type mode. And they notice that and teach people how to notice it themselves and to unlock it, to unfixate, to become unfixated in general. Now, this is one thing when it comes to bodies, where if I put my hands on a student's head and try to show them certain joints, I can tell if they're thinking because the movement isn't particularly fluid. Once they've become in that state of mind where their mind is quickened, when they are sufficiently conscious of what's going on, it's like moving around something highly fluid and easy, and I'm putting no work at all. I'm not pushing their head around, I'm just inviting, and their head is going with, if you like. They're not wondering what's going on, they're kind of going with and fully alive in that sense. Now, that's a much more useful frame for me to talk about what this thing is than just saying, oh, it's switching on a reflex system or whatever I think old-fashioned Alexander teachers used to say. But it's the unfixation thing that really interests me because that applies not just in bodies, but in the body-mind, in the psycho-physical, spiritual system, that all these things at once, where we can become unfixated and where it's useful not to be fixated. So like the child who is learning how to cycle and is scared of hitting the tree, if they fixate on tree, they're going to fixate on tree and go into the tree. It's very difficult to unfixate once you're there, to say, I'm going to go that way instead. There's a certain move required to go no to that thing, expand out and say, I'm going to go that way instead. And the state that Alexander technique points at is what I'm thinking about or calling global unfixation. So even though I'm talking to you now, I could stand up and go over there. I could do something else. All of these options are available to me. I'm just choosing to maintain this one. Now, this is a very different way of being from how we normally are because we don't tend to notice fixation. Particularly in this kind of context I'm doing now, I often see people who are talking and they're kind of like, they're so focused on talking to the lens, talking to the camera, that they point out and they kind of get stuck. They rush into the sentences, they forget what else they can say. And the general dynamic becomes one of compression and rigidity, and my breathing has changed. Whereas if I turn all that stuff off and become unfixated, I can still relate, but in a bigger space, in a bigger possibility space. It relates to the idea of couldness, which I'll leave a link to a note in the description below. So I'd like to explore this frame a lot more, because this unfixation, I think, is the thing that can translate nicely into the bigger picture of what the value of AT is. how do we become unfixated as a society? How do we grow into a position where each of us notices, or is able to notice when we're fixated, and then make a subtle mental move, which I think is related to AC's conception of inhibition, to become unfixated, zoom out again, and then to live in a bigger space such that we can have agency in the larger world we're occupying as individuals. Otherwise, the way of being is caught in these habitual grooves where you go from fixation to fixation to fixation, always repeating the same behaviors and the same habits, the same conditioning, because you're unable to notice what's going on and step out of it. And it's only when you notice you're fixated that you can choose not to be, and then to do something else instead. So that's something on my mind. I think I'd like to reframe a bunch of my Alexander Technique course to reflect this kind of language. I don't talk about fixation at all, but it will need some further riffing of talking points to kind of get this a bit clearer. So I hope that's interesting, hope that's useful. If you have any questions on what I mean by this, please let me know, and I will be writing about this a whole lot more. So cool, thanks, see you next time.